Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. On behalf of the Ukraine House Organizing Committee, we would like to introduce someone who has been integral to the effort of this house, Ukraine House Davos, in its 4 years of existence. We are grateful to him for his vision and his ongoing support. Ukrainian businessman, founder of the Viktor Pinchuk Foundation, Mr. Viktor Pinchuk.
Thank you. Today, we have 23rd of May. It's not always happen like that, that you can remember exactly what did you make exactly 3 months ago. But I remember it was exactly the same time, around 6 p.m. European time. It was 7 p.m. in Kyiv. And I met together with other Ukrainian business leaders, with President of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. It was exactly this moment, 3 months ago. Maybe you also participated in this meeting. It was round table. And President of Ukraine spoke about unity. He said that we have to be together, all Ukrainians and of course Ukrainian business. He spoke really very wisely already, and still we were not sure that he knew that what will happen in a few hours, because he still tried to convince us that we have to continue to invest, and we promised to him, of course, to continue to invest into Ukraine, in the peaceful Ukraine. But also we promised to him, of course, to be together, absolutely, to be together with Ukraine. And if war will happen, we promise that we will fight. And today, no, of course, I know that Ukrainian business fighting together with all Ukrainian people on the different fronts, on the military, economical, political, diplomatic, cultural, informational, etc. And for us, for many Ukrainian business people, it's absolute priority, and absolute, it's not nothing else, it's 24/7. And one of our projects, we're really proud to have this joint project with our partners, Horizon Capital and NIS Enterprise, to have this project, Ukrainian House. And together we try to create the most powerful program. And one of the ideas came to our mind was to ask Timothy Snyder to talk. You know, during a few years I was sure that Timothy Snyder, he is, if not 100% Ukrainian, at least he has Ukrainian roots. No, really. I didn't believe when some people told me, no, Viktor, he is not Ukrainian. I said, okay, at least he is Ukrainian in his heart and in his mind, and at least intellectually he is with us. And I just would like to say a few words which I put on the paper. Of course, it's an honor to introduce Timothy Snyder. The stories are not just nice, stories shape now how we view the world. Stories give sense to our lives. Ukraine was long a blind spot in the story of Europe and the world. Of course, Ukraine was there, but many people did not get it. People knew the name, but they did not understand. And with Ukraine as blind spot, people understood all Europe wrong, understood Russia wrong, understood their own history and present also wrong. People lived with a twisted compass and wrong map with incomplete Wikipedia. If one person started telling the story of Ukraine in powerful words that change this, I believe it's Timothy Snyder. Yeah. So many people told me they read Bloodlands and the world was not the same for them after this. Tim works on highest level of historical science, but he speaks also in words that touch people, shake them, shape their self-perception anew. Based on such retelling, reconceptualization, the history of Europe with Ukraine, its right place, all history and all analysis of the present must be rewritten. It will be a task for generations of historians, politologists, sociologists. I think today, because of the war, people in Europe and the West start feeling this need. The person in the West who knocked on the compass and got the needle to orient itself on the North Pole was Tim Snyder. And today, every day, Tim tries to do more heavy lifting. He tries with his own hands to get done as much of the generational task as possible, to explain to America and the world Ukraine, and what Ukraine means for their future in double speed, triple speed, tenfold speed. Because today it's not only important, it's vital. Only those in the West with the right compass will do the right thing, will give the right priorities, will act with the right speed, will do what they can to save lives, will do what they can to fight the evil, will do what they can to save freedom. The compass is in Ukraine. Timothy, thank you very much that you accepted our invitation to talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Victor. I don't think I need it. Okay. Okay, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to see you. I'm grateful for the kind introduction. But before I begin, I should make some acknowledgments of my own. I think it's very important, first of all, to acknowledge that all conversations that we are having now, if they are at all hopeful about democracy and the future of democracy, are thanks to Ukrainians. Had Ukrainians, not just President Zelensky, but had Ukrainians in general behaved differently in February and March, this would have been a much darker spring and a much darker world for all of us. So this conversation that we're having is one of many thousands of conversations around the world that have been made possible by Ukrainians. So I want to acknowledge that. And of course, it was very kind of Mr. Pinchuk to mention my non-Ukrainian Ukrainianness. But if I am a non-Ukrainian Ukrainian, it's of course thanks to the actual Ukrainians who were patient with me as I was learning the language and from whose work and history I've learned. So I appreciate the kind words, but whatever I have done, it's on the basis of work that colleagues have done, especially colleagues from Ukraine. So, I mean, the thing that has been the most impressive for me about the fighting of this war has been that Ukrainians are doing the things that they can do, that each person I know in Ukraine is taking part in some way in this war in the most literal, absolute sense. Many of my colleagues and friends are on the front, but that everyone is doing something, that everyone is bringing something. So what I can bring is very humble compared to what other people can bring. But what I think I can bring is a word about history, and therefore a word about why Ukraine matters in the present and will matter so much in the future. This institution, the World Economic Forum, is an institution which insists on the future. And I've noticed in the last few years, it insists on the future ever more insistently. It's almost as though we've become desperate to imagine that the future just has to be better than the present. I think now we've reached a turning point in that, or a breaking point in all of that, where we realize that we can't just come up with a better slogan each year about the future. We must be in a position to understand the past, to see the turning points that lie before us, to see the possible futures that lie before us. Because if we're at a turning point, well, really the better metaphor is a hinge, a door, right? The fact that Ukrainians have resisted has opened a door. It's created an aperture. It's created the possibility for certain kinds of futures which wouldn't be here if Ukrainians hadn't resisted. And so we need to think about where that resistance can lead, how we can bring about more futures, more possible futures, by helping this war to end in the right way. Because if this war ends in the wrong way, then it's not only a catastrophe for Ukraine, horrible though that thought already is, it's also a catastrophe for Europe and a catastrophe for the entire world. So I want to pick up on the point that Mr. Pinchuk made about the blind spot around Ukraine. The blind spot around Ukraine has made it impossible for people to see that this war was coming, but also impossible to see what it meant. I completely agree with the point that we have misunderstood not only Russia, but the broader history of Europe, and I would go further than that, the entire history of European colonialism without the proper history of Ukraine at the center. So what I'd like to do with you in the next half an hour or so, and then I hope we'll have some time for questions, is to say a word about just how Ukraine can be so important. And I realize that many of you are Ukrainians and you don't doubt that Ukraine is important, but you know, for the minority of you who may still have questions, but maybe even for Ukrainians there'll be some new thoughts here. How can it be so important and at the same time so invisible? And of course, I'm going to suggest that sometimes the things that are the most important are precisely invisible because they're too dark to look at. They're too hard to look at. And then the moment comes where you have to face them. To do this, I'm going to go all the way back. I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning of the history of democracy and the myth that's at the beginning of the history of democracy. Democracy, at least in a Western tradition, begins with Athens and the Athenian city-state. In the myth of the foundation of the city of Athens, there are two rival deities who wish to be the patrons of the city. One of them is Athena, and she gives to the city the olive tree. And the olive tree is very nice. You can consume the olive oil. You can sit under in the shade of the olive tree. You can discuss, you can have leisure. All of those things are very important for democracy. The other god who appeared was Poseidon, and Poseidon was carrying in his hand a trident. And Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, and salt water came rushing forth. And the Greeks said, "We're not sure we're so impressed with that." But what I want to suggest is that although Athena wins this contest, we're going to have to keep Poseidon in mind as well. Because what Poseidon stands for, he's the god of the sea, is how everything is connected, how democracies are connected, but that gesture, the striking the trident against the ground, also stands for the fact that democracies can't be content with leisure. They can't be content with everyday survival, that sometimes you have to take a stand for a democracy. Sometimes you have to be angry. So how was Greek democracy possible, right? There are other historians in the room who know the answer to this question. How could you devote all of your agricultural land to olive trees? Because ancient Athens imported its grain from across the Black Sea, from the Black Earth of what is now southern Ukraine. Right? The integral material connection between the lands that are now Ukraine and the world of democracy is there from the very beginning, but not necessarily noticed and not necessarily understood. For the ancient Greeks, Ukraine was a land of myth. It was where they placed the Hyperborean mountains and the Elysian fields and fields of gold and ambrosia, which were guarded by griffins and by giants. It appears in the maps of ancient Greeks, but populated by these mythical beasts. It appears in the geography of Ptolemy, but very inaccurately. The myth of Athene and Poseidon and the geography and all of this Greek lore comes to us by way of the Arabs, and it comes to us by way of Byzantium. Kiev comes to Byzantium, interestingly, from the north. Kiev joins the classical world from the north. The city of Kiev exists in the 6th century or the 7th century, but it comes to Byzantium, it comes to this classical heritage from the north, by way of Vikings with names like Valdemar and Yaroslav, who you might know as Volodymyr and Yaroslav, right? But that's not how they called themselves. That's not how they appear in the Icelandic sagas, right? Yes. So the Vikings in general convert all around Europe around the year 1000. They do so in Ukraine as well. It's more interesting in Ukraine because in Ukraine the Vikings who convert have alternatives: Western Christianity, Judaism, Islam, which is a signal of the variety of belief which persists in Ukraine. But it's also a signal of something else I want to make a theme, which is how Ukraine passes through all of the main phases of the history of the West, just more so, just with greater intensity and complexity. And that greater intensity and complexity is what makes Ukrainian history the most interesting European history. But it's also sometimes what makes it too much to bear. Ukraine was the center of a grand Byzantine experiment. The Byzantines created this language, this alphabet, which eventually comes to be called Cyrillic. They create this language which we call Church Slavonic, this language that then becomes the basis of law, right, beginning under Yaroslav in ancient Kiev. And that language of law allows Kiev to become the center of a medieval state, which interchanges with other medieval states, which has, like other medieval states, a succession problem. Who rules next? Who rules after the ruler dies? And that for me is particularly significant today, by the way. When I think of Valdemar, I think of the two different transcriptions of Valdemar, the Vladimir in Russian and Volodymyr in Ukrainian, and how these represent two very different answers to the problem of succession, the problem of how you keep a state going, which was the problem of ancient Kiev and Rus. In Russia, there is no answer to this problem. No one knows what's going to happen after Vladimir, and that is the tension which is built into that political system, a tension which has to be released in things like imperial wars. Volodymyr won 73% of the vote. Ukraine may have problems, but it is a democracy where we know the procedure for choosing who the ruler who comes next. After the destruction of Kiev and Rus by the Mongols, the vast majority of the territories of ancient Kiev fall into something called the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which then falls into something called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. These were the largest European countries of the day. And so in this sense, Ukrainian history is very typical of European history. Inside of Poland, Lithuania, these larger states, Ukraine passes through the Renaissance. It passes through the recovery of those ancient Greek texts that I talked about, but it passes through the Renaissance in a particularly intense and characteristic way. If the Greek world involved the Black Sea and the Mediterranean and the Adriatic, the Renaissance world, the Renaissance age of discovery, was the entire world. The Renaissance world was a time when the Dutch and the Portuguese and the English and the Italians were exploring the entire world. How did Ukraine fit into that? It fit into that in a very particular way. All of the energies of these important European intellectual trends, the Renaissance, the Reformation, arrive in Ukraine at the same time as a Polish version of colonization, such that very quickly Ukraine becomes a breadbasket for the whole world, and Ukrainian peasants are increasingly oppressed into serfdom, so this can be the place, at the same time that their elites begin to speak another language, which is Polish, at the same time that their elites end up belonging to another religion, which is Roman Catholicism. This leads to an event which all of you will know, but which I'm going to frame in a slightly different way, which is the Cossack Rebellion of 1648. The Cossack Rebellion of 1648 takes place in an already globalized world. It is a classic anti-colonial and indeed proto-national moment. A Ukrainian national or anti-colonial moment actually happens rather early in the day compared to other European histories. And this is incredibly important, not just for the reasons that we all know. The reasons we all know is that this brings about a huge war. The Poles are eventually defeated, but they're defeated because this new state, Moscow, is brought into the picture. In 1648, when this rebellion takes place, the first Russian explorer reached the Pacific Ocean, which gives you a sign of where that state was generally headed. The 1648 rebellion brings Moscow turning back to the West, and where it will eventually generate the story which everyone is very familiar with, which is that everything that happened in Kiev and Kievan Rus somehow has to be Russian. During the 19th century, when that becomes the story of the Russian Empire, the Ukrainian counterstory is very interesting and also very progressive, associated generally with the historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky. The Ukrainian counterstory says that history isn't just about a lineage of power. History isn't even about the claims that rulers always make to be connected to some past realm. History is about the continuity of culture. It's about the continuity of society. In other words, history is primarily about the people, right? In this sense, the Ukrainian counterstory was fundamentally democratic in the 19th century. It was fundamentally about the people. And that, of course, is a very important answer to a very important question. What do you do after empire? That's the most important question, I think, of the 19th, 20th, and indeed 21st centuries. What do you do after empire? And one possible answer is that you have democracies. Another possible answer is you have democracies that work together. In 1918, like other European states, like other European nations, Ukrainians attempted to establish a republic, which is another ancient word. It's basically the Latin calque for the Greek word democracy. And when Ukrainians tried to establish a democracy, a republic, the Ukrainian National Republic in 1918, its symbol was the trident, right? Its symbol was the trident. And so in that symbol and in the word republic, we have this interesting unity of these two parts, I think, of a tradition. But this was a republic which faced multiple, let's call them gently, competitors for the same territory. And this is a theme of the larger history that I'm trying to tell you. The attempt at Ukrainian self-determination is very difficult because of the number of forces opposing it. Right? In 1918, for example, the Czechoslovaks had a rather easier time. They had Western backers. Far more people died for Ukraine in those years than died for Czechoslovakia. But nevertheless, there was a Czechoslovakia and not a Ukraine. And that is because in 1918, there was a, just to put it very quickly and summarily, there was a Polish issue, there was a German issue, there was an Austrian issue, there was a White Russian issue, and there was also a Bolshevik issue. And I won't go through the 12 or 13 different occupations of Kiev during that period, which all Ukrainian school children I know struggle to learn. But the upshot, as you will all know, is that the Bolsheviks finally destroy the Ukrainian National Republic. Now, that is only the beginning of a particular period of darkness, a particular period of empire, which makes the Ukrainian story so hard to see. One answer to the big question, what to do after empire, is more empire, or more intense empire, or empire inside Europe itself. And the reason why Ukraine is so difficult for us, for almost everyone to see, is that Ukraine was at the very center of two of these neo-imperial projects. There was the Stalinist idea, which is that the Soviet Union becomes its socialist self by way of exploiting the most fertile parts of its territory, including Ukraine. Ukraine, in his version of progress, in the version of the 5-year plan, in the version of collectivization, is the land that can be exploited, this is language he uses, a land that can be exploited in a project of internal or self-colonization. Well, that attempt, as you will all know, leads to Stalin blaming Ukraine and Ukrainians for the failure of collectivization in 1932, and to the death of about 4 million people unnecessarily in 1933. That is one project, and that would surely be enough, but it coincides in time, perfectly almost, with a second project. When Hitler looks upon the collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union, he sees it as a positive example. When Hitler looks upon the starvation of Ukrainians, he thinks that it proves When Hitler looks upon collectivization of agriculture and the starvation of Ukrainians, he sees it as proof that his own version of neo-empire can be carried out, the version that he called Lebensraum. As very few people in the West tend to recognize, the Second World War was chiefly about Ukraine. The British part and the French part and and D-Day, it's all very interesting. But the center of the war, because this is a war that begins in Hitler's mind, the center of the war is Ukraine. From Hitler's point of view, Ukraine was the territory which would allow Germany to become a world empire, which would allow Germany to displace Britain and the United States. So Hitler planned, the Germans planned, that millions or tens of millions of people would be starved and displaced, and that Ukraine would become the center of a new German empire. This aspiration to destroy the Soviet Union and to make Ukraine the center of an empire is one of the indirect causes, of course, of the Holocaust, because it's the German drive eastward towards empire which puts the lands where most Jews lived under German control. The combination of these two neo-imperial projects meant that between 1933 and 1945, there was no more dangerous place to live in the world than Ukraine. Now, one way to understand that experience, it's not the only way, but one way to understand that experience is as nation destroying. That in the Soviet Union, in the famine, and I won't go into the details of this, it's so painful, but the best people often died first. In the Soviet Union during the terror, it was the very Ukrainians who had made something of themselves in the 1920s who were very often killed first. And then add to that the German occupation, and you have an experience which is not only one of mass death, but which is also one of the destruction of the Ukrainian nation and its village structure and its elites all at the same time. This process is repeated on a smaller scale in the late 1940s, early 1950s under Zhdanov. It's repeated in a different way in the 1970s under Brezhnev. A different kind of logic, but the logic in the 1970s is that there doesn't have to be a Ukrainian elite. There just has to be a Soviet elite. Social assimilation, upward social mobility will be towards a Soviet identity, right? And dissenters will still be sent to a much smaller but still existing gulag or to psychiatric prisons. So one way to understand this is as nation destroying. Now, the interesting thing about the Ukraine that emerges after 1991, aside from the fact, and you'll forgive me this theme, but it's very important to me, aside from the fact that it once again picks up the trident as its symbol, the interesting thing about this republic is that it manages to be a democracy. And I say manages because it wasn't easy, right? There had to be a great effort in 2004, 2005 to sustain a democratic election. There had to be a tremendous effort with considerable sacrifice to sustain a European orientation of the country in 2014 and 2015, which brought a Russian invasion. And when I think of this Ukrainian democracy, I think not only of something that just barely happened, I also think of something that is a kind of model for other people in the following sense. The way that Ukrainians have dealt with the Soviet past, the way that they have dealt with the imperial past has been interesting. Of course, there are moments of complete rejection, which are understandable, and there are moments of total condemnation of particular Stalinist policies with which I completely agree. But there is also a willingness to accept what people in the West like to call hybridity. There's also a willingness to accept that people might speak a couple of languages and that code switching might be a normal part of everyday life. That is particularly Ukrainian. No one else really does that, including the Swiss. There is no other capital. Basel doesn't do it the way that Kiev does it. So, and the way that I think of this as a positive example is that if there are going to be democracies in the 21st century, including my own, they are going to be more like that than they are now. There is going to be more rather than less difference, and the ability to accommodate difference, especially under the stress of war, is a sign that there's something in Ukraine which is worth noticing and I think even imitating or seen as a model. Because, of course, this is something that we've made a great mistake about in the West. I mean, we've tended to look at Ukraine and say, well, if they speak Russian, they're Russians, and if they speak Ukrainian, they're nationalists. I'm sorry, but that's how it's been for way too long. And in doing that, we miss obvious points, like that the fact that I'm speaking English doesn't make me English, right? That's an obvious point. But another obvious point is that when people speak more than one language, that might mean that they're better than you and not worse, right? It might mean that they're up to something politically which you can't be up to, and at least is worth thinking about. Now, Russia's a different story, and I'm not going to dwell on it except to very briefly say that obviously the democratic succession never succeeds in this version of Russia. Instead, we have a version of tyranny. We seek for words to describe this thing in Russia, but I actually think the ancient Greek word tyranny applies very beautifully to the situation of a single man ruling, aging, ever more entrapped by illusion, seeking after some kind of grand project that will make him immortal. This is the kind of thing which the ancient Greeks understood. It's also the kind of thing that Shakespeare understood. And I think this confrontation between a Ukraine and a Russia of the 21st century against the backdrop of this history gives us several ways to think about what this war means. And I'm coming now close to the end. This is a war over time. This is a war about time. It's a war about whether we have to die because of what one man thinks about what happened 1,000 years ago or more. I've tried to suggest that the history of Kiev is rich and that things could have gone in very different directions than they did. But what they do not do, however you interpret them historically, past events do not predetermine, to use Mr. Putin's word, they do not predetermine the present. There is no one person who can say that past predetermines who belongs to what nations and why. So this is a war over that. It's a war over whether the past is plural and allows choice, or whether one man can say the past predetermines who you are, regardless of what you think about it. And I have the right to kill you if you don't agree. This is also a war of memory, about the 1930s and 1940s. It's a war, to put it very briefly, about whether the lesson of the Second World War is whether fascism is good or bad. That is now up for grabs. Whether the lesson of the Second World War is whether we need more or less fascism in the world. Whether the lesson of the Second World War is that it is good to destroy neighboring states for racial reasons or not. Whether the lesson of the Second World War is that international law can be entirely ignored, whether democracies are weak. The lessons of the Second World War are now up for grabs. Mr. Putin is interpreting the Second World War to mean that, essentially, Hitler and Stalin were right in 1939. The language that he uses is strikingly similar to the language that Hitler and Stalin used in 1939. This is also a war about empire in a very general way. When Mr. Putin says that there's no Ukrainian state and there's no Ukrainian nation, that language might be unfamiliar in the West, but it is the language of European colonialism for the past 500 years. And it is in this sense that the history of Ukraine is actually a very global history. And it is along these lines, I think, that it's very important for Ukrainians to try to maintain contact with friends and possible allies in the global South, who may tend to see this war as simply about some part of the West against another part of the West. But I think the colonial interpretation is not only true, it's one that opens up a larger conversation. This is also a war about destruction and genocide. This is a war about the right of a people to exist, about the ability of a tyrant to define who you are, and then to, by way of violence, try to enforce that judgment. And finally, and this is the most historical point, this is a war about resources. As in the classical world, as in the early modern age of discovery, it matters a great deal that Ukraine has its black earth. It matters a great deal whether Ukraine wins, and one way that it matters is whether the world will be fed this fall or not. We're looking at the possibility of tens of millions of people starving to death beyond Ukraine because of the Russian blockade of the Black Sea. So then to turn this around, and now I really will be done, what then are the stakes of a Ukrainian victory? I would say the stakes are the future at all. Is there a future? Is there a political future? Will we be able to think about the future? If a hydrocarbon oligarch wins a war funded by his profits from hydrocarbons, where are we in fighting global warming? If the hydrocarbon oligarchs shape the world literally by destroying their neighbors, is it thinkable that we can then get past hydrocarbons and into a world without global warming? This is also a war about the future in the sense of generations. This is an older generation in Russia fighting a younger generation in Ukraine, speaking of the political leadership, right? The average age difference is more than 20 years. The way that Russia is ruled is all about suppressing the men and women in their 40s and keeping them out of power and sending the men in their 20s to go be traumatized and become murderers. That is a method of rule, and this war is also about time in that sense. This is a war about the legacy of the 20th century. How do we thought perhaps that legacy was clear, but it turns out not to be clear. Which language, which ideology, which law? And this is a war for me fundamentally about this basic choice in Europe, which is empire or integration. This is a longer story that I've tried to tell in other books, but the European nation state has really not done very well as a nation state. What has worked very well is European democracies and republics cooperating, either as the European Union or in other forms. And that is why the Ukrainian common sense that we ought to be closer to Europe is so consonant and so correct, matches up so well with actual Ukrainian history and the history of Europe. But those are the choices. I don't think there's actually a third way. And I think the Russian leadership in its own way understands this too, that a war against Ukraine is a war for empire, but it's also a war against integration. It's a war to break up patterns of European cooperation. And if empire wins, that's Russia, that's China in particular, but it's also the idea of empire in general as an organizing principle, as opposed to democracies that choose to cooperate. What's at stake for me is not Ukrainian democracy, although that's very important, not only Ukrainian democracy, but democracy as such. And of course, there is, as I mentioned, the starvation. So, to conclude, because Ukraine is at the center, Ukraine is hard to see. It was hard to see for those ancient Greeks, right? The story of the olive tree and Athena is a nicer story than Poseidon and the salt water, but it's only half of the truth, right? There's another part of the truth. There's the invisible part of the truth. Ukraine is at the center of the age of discovery, but it's not seen that way. But if we see it that way, we're giving ourselves a gift of understanding. It's at the center of the 20th century neo-empires. And if we see that, then we understand Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union and the whole 20th century much better. It is now at the center of this possibility of a democratic renewal in the West and in the world. And unlike in all of these previous moments that I've talked about, although this struggle is horrible against a horrifying enemy, this time there's only one. This time there's only one. The predicament of Ukrainian history has always been that there's been more than one. And this time there's only one. I understand Ukrainian complaints about Germany, and I join them. But this time there's only one power trying to destroy the country. And horrifying though that is, it also means at this time there's hope. So the scene that I want to close with is the scene I opened with, which is Athena and Poseidon. So Athena's right. The olive tree is very nice. Democracy is about leisure and conversation. But it's not only about that. Poseidon is also right. Democracy is about communication. We're all in this together. Democracy is about the way that food and ideas and other things go from one part of the world to another. But democracy is also about that ability to put the trident down. It's about that ability to define a moment as being special and to choose to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Snyder. Yeah. So, and we have now time for several questions. Please raise your hand who want to ask a question. Please, first question.
Дякую. One point in your very interesting historical overview is how do we reach out to that other world, the non-aligned world? Because you're right, we in Europe, we think that everybody supports Ukraine. In the US, we may think so, but it's not the case in Africa, it's not the case in India, it's not the case in many non-aligned countries. So what are those arguments that we can use to tell them? So food is one of them, obviously, but in the colonial history part. Thanks.
The colonial history part is the part that that's the part I've been trying to tell now for several books, because there is a kind of consensus, silent consensus, that European history is about Europeans and then colonial history is about the other people. And this works in two ways. Because the Europeans have a story about the European Union, which is that we were nation states, and then there was a Second World War, and it was bad, and so now we cooperate, which is not true. I mean, it was true that there was a Second World War, but everything else about that story is false. The Europeans were imperial powers, which lost their imperial possessions or their imperial aspirations in the period from, let's say, 1918 to 1968 or so. And the European Union is a response to that. It's another way to have a big trade zone. It's basically a way. It's a soft landing after empire, and so the Europeans bracket the entire imperial history, and then the anti-colonial history, understandably perhaps, puts the Europeans as the other, which makes it very difficult to understand intra-European colonial relationships, like for example the Ottoman Empire or the Russian Empire. So, I mean, I think part of this is that one has to insist that race and colonialism are not the same question. They're very often deeply connected, right? It's very hard to imagine American racism except as it arose in a particular colonial connection with particular relationships. That said, that there can be, that colonialism can happen in different sorts of forms. And then I think the kind of effort that has to be made towards the Russian Empire is to say, I mean, first of all, as many colleagues working on the Global South, to be fair, have already said, this is an empire too, and the same techniques of studying it that we have used with other empires work. And one of those techniques that is very appropriate to Ukraine is the idea of decentering, so that you write the history of the empire not just through the metropole and its own idea of itself, but you write it in terms of the provinces, you write it in terms of the periphery, you write it in terms of other notions of what's going on, which is one way of understanding much of what we actually do in Ukrainian history. But I think, I mean, the basic answer to your question, and this is something that Ukrainian colleagues have to help with, is to make Ukrainian history interesting as global history, right? So for example, the Holodomor, right? The Holodomor, I completely understand why that is an event that is deeply entrenched as Ukrainian history. I understand that. But it is also part of a global history of empire-driven famine, right? It's been missing from that history, right? So Amartya Sen has the classic account of all of this in which Ukraine is missing, right? So if you put Ukraine in, then the history is more convincing and more well-rounded and truer. So things that might seem to be particularly Ukrainian, even the thing which seems most deeply Ukrainian, can be made global because the Indians know about famine, which has to do, right? The notion of political famine, which is the term that Amartya Sen popularized, is actually quite applicable to 1932 and 1933. I realize there are other ways to describe it, but it did happen because of political decisions, just as other famines. It wasn't shortage of food, it was a political decision, right? And then, of course, I mean, there has to, as you say, there has to be a dialogue now about who the partners are in somehow clearing the Black Sea. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Please raise your hand up there, please.
Professor Snyder, thank you very much for that mesmerizing talk. I've been trying very diligently to keep up with the concepts that you were putting out. And I can't remember the early ones, but I remember the last one, which was that you said that there's just one force that needs to be dealt with by Ukraine that will determine the future. But can I add that maybe there's another force too, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. It's kind of a subtle and invisible, less visible force, and it comes from kind of a picture that seems to say that on the part of West Europeans, that we're prepared to sacrifice Ukraine to defend ourselves. And we're prepared to sacrifice Ukraine in order to establish an order that we will be happy with after the fighting starts. And this attitude is also reflected, I think, in comments made recently when the French Macron talks about European Union not being a place for Ukraine, but we'll come up with something else that'll make them happy. And we know kind of what the Germans have been saying. So it seems to me the challenge is not just to deal with that one threat, but the challenge is to deal with these more subtle threats on the West that if not corralled, if not handled, could end up, maybe disaster is too strong a word, but could end up with not a good outcome for Ukraine.
No, I quite take your point. Just to be clear, I was speaking at the most basic level of imperial forces which were actually at the same time trying to control Ukrainian territory. So the 17th century predicament of the Cossacks, where you might like Polish law but oppose how it's applied and rebel, and then imagine that the Tsar is going to respect law and be completely wrong about that. And the Siege is dissolved in 1775, right in the middle of the partitions of Poland, so no one ends up winning in that one. But the fact that the Cossacks were between, right, the Commonwealth and Russia is very characteristic, and the same thing is true in the 20th century. And so when I say that we've gotten down to one, I do think that's historically quite significant. Much as I take your point, I just think in the broad sweep of history, this is actually quite significant, especially since I think that one doesn't necessarily have to be permanent. Now, on your point, I completely agree, and as a historian, There are reference points here which I try to bring people back to, and one of them is Czechoslovakia in 1938. Did it work in 1938 to concede territory? How did that sort itself out? And the other reason why I like this comparison is that the Czechoslovaks probably could have beat the Germans, as no one likes to remember. Right, the Czechoslovaks had the territory they gave up was actually extremely well fortified and included its arms industry. So imagine a counterfactual where Czechoslovakia is not abandoned but instead armed, right? Then there's probably not a Second World War. And I think that's a comparison which I wish people would sit on a little bit longer. Another one is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Germans in particular, in all of their Vergangenheitsbewältigung and Erinnerungspolitik, don't pay much attention to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And for Ukrainians, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact may seem to be something that's about Poland, and of course it was. But as a model of doing business, the model of going from Berlin to Moscow over the territory in between is one that ought to be recognizable. And at the moment we're in this special moment again where Poland doesn't actually threaten Ukrainian territory, which is, that may just seem normal to everybody. But the whole idea that there's a war for Kiev and the Polish army is not there, for a historian, is quite strange, right? That is quite strange. This is a new world when it's only. But my point is here. I think one can calmly think about, as a Ukrainian, one can calmly think about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact now, because the Poles aren't going to respond by saying let's take Lviv, right? So you can think about that, and that's a moment that has to be pushed onto the Germans. The Germans have to be forced to think about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, not least because of the general structure of it, but also because it began the Second World War, but also because it was largely about oil, as everyone forgets. Right? It was largely about the Germans buying oil from the Soviets so that they could then invade Western Europe. So that whole economic aspect to it, which somehow in the Nord Stream discussion, no one mentioned that, right? No one mentioned that. So I think those are the analogies that I would try to bring home, because I agree with you. And then I notice, this is just my historian's point of view, but I notice the arguments that are made on behalf of it are often historical arguments that are quite bad. Right, so the German chancellor has been making these references to the First World War, and people talk about Versailles. Those are not actually good comparisons. So I think one has to make better comparisons. It's tough. It's a tough balance, because if I can enter into these discussions with the Germans, and I'm pretty angry. Like there's an interview with me in Die Zeit where they put the headlines like, "Why are you so angry, Mr. Snyder?" And the reason why I'm angry is that Ukraine has been invaded in a war of destruction, and Germany not only did not foresee it, but it collaborated with the power, which is now funding the power, which is invading Ukraine. That's why I'm angry. I think everyone has a reason to be angry, but one has to nevertheless strike. Oh, okay, thanks. But then one has to find the balance of finding the arguments which work in their discursive space, right? Which appeal to, because they're not. There are currents in German political thought which can help here, but one can't just condemn them, right? One can't just condemn Americans either, one can't just condemn them. One has to find a way to make the history speak, And I realize, for Ukrainians who are under so much more stress than I am right now, that's a tall order, but I think that's what we have to do.
Thank you, and we have time only for one last question.
Thank you so much. Professor Snyder, it was so interesting to me when you were talking about what almost happened. The dark spring that would have happened had Ukrainians not thwarted Putin's plans. As a historian, have you ruminated on the implications had Kiev fallen, had Putin's plans actually occurred? I sometimes, I never want to think about it, but I do think about the global effects of what Ukraine avoided for the world, the complete shattering of global world order, every small country acquiring nuclear weapons, everything becoming militarized because you need to spend money on your defense, not on education or anything like that. I'd love to hear your thoughts of what could have been, what that dark spring may have looked like.
Yeah, no, I very much appreciate the question, because although we can't be sure as historians what the possible counterfactuals are and the possible futures are, we do know as historians that decisions, even decisions made by one person, can hugely influence what the bandwidth of possibility would be. So the comparison is a tired one now, but what if no Churchill, right? What if no Churchill? How then do the Americans ever get into the Second World War? It's unclear to me how we ever get into the Second World War. And if we don't get into the Second World War, how does the Second World War end? In a very different way, presumably, right? Probably with Ukraine under German control. So we have to be aware that the decisions by, in this case, Zelensky's decision to stay and to speak the way that he spoke, which was very important, right? President tut, right? That's very important. Like I'm here, I'm doing my job. That kind of example is very important. I think in a small scale, had Ukraine, so to be clear, I think Ukraine was going to fight. I was asked over and over again, as were people close to me beforehand, what's going to happen? And I said, I don't know what the Russians are going to do, but if they invade, the Ukrainians are going to fight. Like that, I was pretty sure of. But in the scenario you're talking about where Ukraine loses quickly, I think it's a huge demoralization for the Biden administration in particular, and for people who support American democracy in general. Because the people who oppose American democracy are also very friendly with Mr. Putin. And Mr. Putin has done a lot of work to try to destabilize my democracy. So it would have been a blow for this administration and for American democracy. It would have been wind in the sails of people around the world who say that democracy is a joke, democracy is weak, democracy can never get anything done. The stereotype would have been, look at Ukraine, democracies are all messed up, they can't defend themselves, right? That's the lesson people would have drawn. That lesson would have been drawn everywhere, right? The Chinese, for example, would have loved that lesson, but also particular politicians, like I certainly can imagine Marine Le Pen winning the French election or coming much closer. I think Orban would have won by more than he won by. I think the whole structure of European politics would have changed, and this group of people who are on the far right that we nationalists, let's call them, would have done much better. But we also wouldn't have had, we wouldn't have had this moment of hope that we have, right? So I realize in Ukraine this isn't exactly a moment of hope. But for the rest of us, the fact that there are some people who are taking risks helps others to understand that democracy is not just a state of affairs, but also a value, right? Where the definition of value is something for which you take risks, something for which, at least in some circumstances, you're willing to take risks. And because democracy itself, in order to exist, has to be that, too many of us have gotten ourselves convinced that democracy is a result of there being no alternatives, or it's a result of some iron law of history, it's a result of capitalism. It's not a result of any of those things. I started I talked about Athens because I love the story of Athena and Poseidon. You can tell me later if that doesn't work, But I love the way the trident works in that story, that Athena was right, but it's not the whole truth, that there's another side to democracy as well. But of course, Greek democracy failed over and over again. And early modern democracies, like the Polish-Lithuanian one, also failed. And after 1918, most of those democracies failed. Democracy is really hard. And it's been paralyzing to the point of suicide for us to imagine that there was no alternative and that these things were just going to work out, right? And so here we're being given this lesson about how it's not just about all the forces can seem to be arrayed against you, and still you can take action, right? Still you can take risks on the basis of values. And so for all of those of us who have to take smaller risks, that's been very heartening, right? That's been very heartening. It's for a lot of people, it's the first, this goes deep into America. I don't know how far you can see into America from here, but in tiny towns in America, people are flying Ukrainian flags. Tiny little towns, right? People in America who have nothing else to talk about, who can't agree on anything else, can agree about Ukraine. And that's because of this basic sense that there's this tremendous indecency that's happened, but also I think because of this basic sense that people can share, regardless of other convictions, that look, there are things that you can take risks for, and here are people who are taking risks for those things. Without Ukraine, we wouldn't have that.
Thank you very much.